Entrepreneur, author, and financial consultant Mark Bernstein helps high-performing entrepreneurial business owners create a vision for the future and follow through on their goals and intentions. Ange Honorato is a business growth strategist who blends psychology and business together to create conscious leaders and business owners who impact the world. Founders Forum is a radio show podcast sharing the real stories behind entrepreneurship as founders discover more about themselves while providing valuable lessons and some fun and entertainment for you. Now, here's Mark and Ange.
Good morning, America. It's a very beautiful day here in Philadelphia in October, a day that we should be experiencing fall, but we're experiencing a little bit more summer. And I'm very excited about today's show. We have a great guest who's going to bring a lot of energy, I know. We've got Ange, who's on fire today, and we've got a lot of stuff happening in Philadelphia sports, which I don't want to bore you with outside of Philadelphia, except that it's a great story a couple great stories going on right now. The Phillies just won their first playoff game last night. I believe, and we talked about this, and we'll talk about, maybe get into the reason, but I believe the Phillies will win the World Series. I never make those kind of predictions, but I'm saying that. And there's a reason I believe that, and it's related to the story that Ange is going to tell you about. The Eagles are on fire. They're undefeated, getting criticism from all corners, especially in Philadelphia. But you can't argue with 4-0 because it's the only way to get to 5-0. So, according to Nick Sirianni, which is true. So, given that, Ange, what's on your mind about this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm super excited. 80 degrees in October. It's Red October, all the reasons that you just mentioned. But we were chatting offline, and I'm super excited to, have our guest weigh in on this when she tells her story, because I think there's a lot of things that are similar. But the story of Trey Turner, for anyone that doesn't know or doesn't follow baseball, baseball is a very streaky sport to begin with, right? When you can get into a slump, it can last a very long time. And so when the Phillies brought on Trey Turner from the Nationals, which is the hometown of our guest here, so there's a connection there as well, but paid a lot of money for him, and he hit a really bad slump this summer. I mean, really, really bad. And Philly is notorious for being really rough on their teams and coaches. And collectively, they decided that they weren't going to boo him, that the entire stadium was going to stand up and give a standing ovation. And when they
Which
did that,
I just have to say is the opposite of what Philadelphia is known for.
Yeah. Again, this is the city that throws snowballs famously at Santa Claus, as we talked about. So when they decided that they were going to stand up and be positive and really boost this guy up, it's less stuff that movies are made of. I mean, since that day, he has been batting like a scorching record. He had a huge game in Game 1 win last night at the World Series. So I just think it's an amazing story, and celebrating your teammates and lifting them up. They're going to do their part and turn around and lift you up. So yeah, it's a great story.
It's the Philadelphia sports miracle right now.
Absolutely.
But before we introduce Gina officially, Gina, I think there's some parallels to what's happened in your business. And maybe you might want to comment on that, and then we'll get into your story.
Hi. Well,
Hi.
I think one of the like far back parallels is that the neighborhood that I opened my first location in was really an underdog. It had sat dormant for decades and boarded up houses and no businesses, very few businesses. And so when the community members started to rally around bringing it back and attracting new residents, it became this groundswell of support that ended up turning Logan Circle into just one of the best neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. So I think there's a lot of parallels. Yeah. Go Philadelphia.
Well, that sounds like a Philly story right there. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think there might be some, and we can get into it when we talk about the culture of your company, but I think there might be some parallels there about people lifting each other up as well. So with that, let's introduce Gina Schaefer, who is the founder and former CEO of a chain of hardware stores that are part of the Ace Hardware Cooperative, which probably everybody knows. And with her team, she grew the business to 13 locations in a relatively short period of time with 300 teammates and over $50 million in revenue. She's also the author of Recovery Hardware, which chronicles her growth while hiring from the local recovery community, which alludes a little bit to the story she was just telling. So with that, Gina, what I'd like to ask you is, how in the heck did you get into the hardware business? Because I know it wasn't something that was natural for you. And what was your journey leading up to that? And how did you get there, and what's happened since?
So many things to tell you. I'm working on a funny speech right now where I talk about how I got started. And the first time I used a power tool was 5 months after I'd opened my first hardware store. So if that tells you anything about the zero experience I had, I was 30 years old, a tech reject, I called myself, during the boom and bust of the mid 90s of the tech industry. And I was laid off 3 or 4 times. And I had moved to the neighborhood that I mentioned that people were moving to because it was an inexpensive place to live. And the final time that I got laid off, I said, that's it. I'm going to not work in the tech industry. I'm going to do something to help this community. And really, we wanted a hardware store. The closest local hardware store was far enough away that it was kind of frustrating to get to, challenging to get to. And none of my neighbors wanted to go to the suburbs to go to a big box. And we didn't have any big box hardware stores in DC at the time. So I sort of on a whim said, why can't I open a hardware store? And I reached out to Ace Hardware, and I did.
That's wonderful. By the way, it's a separate issue, but maybe I'll bring it up now. I have a long-term client that's a 4th generation hardware store. That at one time, I may have mentioned this to you when we first met, they had over 300,000 items in their store because it's a 4-story store and they have holes in the wall, and through the holes, the chains are coming out and they cut the chains that people need, and
awesome.
All these little nooks and crannies. But ultimately it's a sad story because they're about to liquidate now. And, it's too much pressure from the big box stores, from the Home Depots and the other stores. So how, I know your chain, it's not your chain, but your group of stores is still very successful. How is the obstacle of the big box stores, and how have you dealt with that, and how is the business doing in relation to that?
Well, I think for us, online retailers scare me a lot more than the big boxes now. I mean, we've been sort of fortunate in our 2 major markets. We're in DC and Baltimore, and then we have a couple stores in Northern Virginia. Baltimore still doesn't have any big box retailers in the city limits. So we are essentially the only game in town. And so we've managed to stay relevant in our communities by being very community centric and being the only game in some cases. In DC, we do have a Home Depot and a Lowe's, but I really worry more about people ordering online, frankly, than I do them getting in their cars or a cab and going to a big box. And we've really stayed relevant, one, by being very community centric. Again, we do a lot of in-store events, which you can't find at an online retailer, or not so much at big boxes. And then really modernizing, it's a very multi-generational kind of old school in a positive way, but an old school business model. And a lot of retailers haven't modernized to keep up with, inventory technologies and pricing plans, e-commerce, social media. And we have really, really tried to focus on all of those things.
I just wonder, though, as someone who's not very handy, I like to go, now I have to go to the big box stores, but I used to love to go to this hardware store to get advice because I don't know how to use that stuff. You can't if I buy it online, I'll inevitably buy the wrong tool. Isn't that something that works in your favor to a certain extent?
Most people think that we're recession proof, and we are certainly more recession proof than a lot of businesses, right? Because if your toilet breaks, you have to fix it. It's not a fluff purchase. But there are still, lots of reports that show that, and I'm not going to spout numbers because I'll get them wrong, but a large percentage of people are still buying a lot of things they would buy at a hardware store online. And frankly, we sell more things like candles and greeting cards in some cases than some of the tools that we sell. We've really broadened to become more of a general store in a lot of cases because people, at least in DC, don't think of us necessarily for power tools or hand tools.
Greeting cards. That's the business I grew up in. That's actually in my book. So I'll tell you about that. I have a connection for you there if you need it.
Great.
But interesting. So you started your store, I think, was it 2003 or 2003? Yeah. So you built, I'm going to say, that's somewhat of a hardware store empire. I know you wouldn't call it that.
I love that word.
But it sort of is. And you did it in 20 years, which is pretty amazing. And now, well, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I'd like to hear a little bit how that happened, but then also how you've sort of transitioned into your new role and new leadership in the company.
Yeah, so the down and dirty with the expansion, we opened. So we is my husband. He joined me about 3 months after I opened that first store. He decided that it would be fun for him to be in the hardware business too. So he quit his tech job and joined me. He's currently the company's CFO. We opened the first store in 2003, and then the second one in 2005, and then one a year for 10 years after that. And then it gets a little wonky the lineage after that. But Historically, banks had discriminated against lending to cooperatives. They didn't understand. There's not one person to pin ownership on, and the model's a little strange. So the federal government chartered National Cooperative Bank in the 1970s. And so when we were looking to open our second location, we were introduced to National Cooperative Bank, NCB, and they've funded our expansion. So over the ensuing years, we built 10 stores from scratch, purchased 5, and had to close 2 for non-performance. And so we were fortunate to have a really strong banking partner and be in markets that really supported us. And so we grew fairly quickly. We don't own any of our properties. People always say, how many of your buildings do you own? We sacrificed buying expensive real estate for expansion. I think it would have really hindered any kind of expansion because, any property in DC is millions of dollars. And so there was a trade-off there for us.
Can we back up 1 second and just the cooperative concept? How does that work in the Ace Hardware world?
Yeah, Ace is a purchasing cooperative. And so their sole mission, they're actually going to be 100 years old in 2024. Their sole mission is to get better pricing for the members. And so we pay a membership fee. It gives us 1 vote. And they warehouse products that they negotiate prices for in various warehouses around the country. And then we buy from them. They do a lot more than that. They have amazing wraparound services for the members now, like training and merchandising, and they host conventions. But at its core, they purchase products to get better pricing for us and warehouse it.
Yeah. So Gina, I was going to ask a similar question. I'm very curious, and I think a lot of our listeners might be curious about this as well, as the world and the market kind of is what it is. The idea for you initially to choose a franchise type model versus maybe starting something from scratch or on your own, and how did you select this particular franchise? Did they have that cooperative then as well? Because I think that's one of the things that might prevent some people. It's like, well, it's a franchise, but they're very pricey, and then I still have to kind of figure it all out on my own. Like, maybe walk us through a little bit about that, and how did that benefit you to be able to propel and do that 1 a year after that?
Yeah, so there actually aren't any hardware franchises in the United States. So I didn't have the franchise. Joining a franchise wasn't an option. So if you want to start a hardware store, you either join a cooperative or you buy from a wholesaler, or you do some combination of the two. And so this is a very simple example that I think clarifies why a cooperative is so valuable. I probably have, 2,000 vendors in my store, 3,000 vendors in my store. And my stores aren't that big. And so it's a significant number. You can imagine if I had to buy from 3,000 people individually, 3,000 companies, and pay 3,000 companies individually, what a nightmare it would be. Ace streamlines that for us because we buy directly from them. We pay 1 bill. And then they deal with all of the aggregated bills from all of the members. And so that one example alone makes joining the co-op financially, makes it make sense.
Wow. Yeah. No, that's great. And I'm sure a lot of people don't realize that. So that's a good pro tip.
Yeah.
So Gina, after 20 years, you're no longer CEO and your ownership situation has changed. So let's talk about how you arrived at that decision and how you did it and where all that stands now.
So people had started asking what my exit strategy was going to be in 2003. And I was young and I had no idea why I needed to think about it. Fast forward 17 years, I decided that it was time to start thinking about it. COVID hit. The protests in Washington that happened in 21, 22, 19, or 2020, all marched down the street where my office is. And it made a very emotional impact on my husband and I and on our leadership team, because we realized that as a small business, we could probably do something to help create generational wealth, help bridge the equity divide, and just do something. And when we started researching succession plans, we found the ESOP model, and we realized that was the something that we could do, that the folks who were helping us build the business could participate in equity ownership of the business. And that would ultimately be the way we left the business.
Well, we've got more questions on that, but it's time for a quick break, and we'll pick up there right after our commercial.
In her book, Recovery Hardware, Gina Schaefer shares a powerful true story of her journey building a chain of hardware stores to help revitalize urban communities, provide opportunities for everyone to thrive, and become gathering places for neighbors. Once a lively hub, Washington, D.C.'s Logan Circle crumbled in the aftermath of the 1968 riots. Decades of neglect led boarded-up buildings, overgrown and littered sidewalks, and a widespread of drug use and addiction. When she was laid off for the 4th time, she decided to do something about the blight. As she likes to say, just because the world underestimates us does not mean our fate is pre-written. Order Recovery Hardware today or wherever you buy books, or go to recoveryhardware.com.
We are back on Founders Forum with our guest today, Gina Schaefer. And Gina, you were just saying before the break about that you found the ESOP model be the right way to go in terms of ownership succession. So for those who don't know how an ESOP works, I know you've become a little bit, maybe not an expert, but very familiar with the concept. Maybe explain that. And also along with that, I know came a change in the leadership of the company. We can talk about that as well.
Sure. So an ESOP is an employee stock ownership plan. It basically operates like a qualified retirement plan. So for the listeners that understand how a 401k works, for example, a company creates a trust, and the trust buys the business on behalf of the employees. And so Mark, my husband, and I sold 30% of the business so far. It'll probably end up being probably a 7-year plan to get the company to 100% employee ownership. There's a board that's created that includes a trustee who's responsible for making sure that everything is working as it should on behalf of the employees. ESOPs are heavily regulated by the Department of Labor. So we felt it causes a lot of work, but it also gives you a lot of comfort to know that what you're doing is in the best interest of the employees that are becoming the stewards of the business, the owners of the business. And then as part of that transition was also my transition out as CEO. And so when we announced in August of, 2021 that we were creating the ESOP, we just went through our second valuation this year. When we announced that we were creating the ESOP, we also announced that I would be leaving in 2 years, and thus starting an executive search for a new CEO.
First of all, great simple description of an ESOP. So as you know, I'm a financial planner. I'm in this business. I might add, and I know this is not what drove your decision, because your whole concept from the beginning was to benefit the community. And I know this decision was to benefit your company and the employees. But there are, if you meet the requirements, there are tax benefits for the business owner as well. And I bring this up because a lot of our listeners are business owners and a lot of our guests are business owners. So it's good for them to know about that. But tell me about how you came up with who would lead the company going forward and how that worked.
Yeah, thanks for the tidbit on the taxes. I really should write down an elevator pitch, because the concept is not that difficult. But when you start explaining it, I envision circles and diagrams, right. And I get a little flustered because I've never been the financial person in our business.
You and I can go on the road together.
Let's do it. Let's tag team. I will bring the human aspect. You bring the sense.
Oh, you get the fun stuff. But anyway,
I think we were told that if we had sold to private equity or on the open market, we would have had to have gotten like a 20 or 25% premium, because of the tax benefits that we as sellers, my husband and I as sellers, and the business as now the ESOP owners benefit, the tax benefits that we get. So I was in a very fortunate situation to have as part of my ACE peer group, Craig Smith. Craig comes from a multi-generational hardware family that's been around for, maybe 75 years. And he owned a store in Fairfax, Virginia. And so Mark and I approached him in 2022, I guess, and said, would you be willing to, we would like to purchase your company, bring your teammates on as part of our ESOP, and then hire you as our CEO. What do you think about that? And that was a lot for him to take in. Mm-hmm. He was very excited about it. But what he had to really think about was the fact that he would be relinquishing ownership. Right. At that point, he was the 100% proprietor of his own hardware store. He has growth aspirations. He's an amazing leader. But in order to take this opportunity, he had to agree to sell his ownership stake, because we were committed to creating 100% ESOP.
Right.
Yeah. And Gina, as I know, so we have enough time to chat on this about your employees and about the community and the impact. Tell us a little bit about, I understand from a financial and an organizational perspective why you chose the ESOP model, but let's talk a little bit about your book and why you've chosen in many ways to open up your community and your business to bring on the type of employees. And so you're, in my opinion, you're really giving back to the community in multiple ways. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, I think at its core, the community gave back to me. So when we opened in Logan Circle, and I didn't know anything about hardware, and I might have opened with 4 employees. I mean, I knew nothing really. And the neighborhood itself was just coming back from, decades of neglect. It was the community that supported me and filled my cash registers and made sure we were able to expand and hire more people. So that made me really feel a sense of responsibility, not beholden to, but I really started to understand the value of a community-based business. I'm
sorry, I just have to point out, it's like the Phillies fans and Trey Turner. We came full circle.
There we go. There's our connection.
Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
Right. No. We needed to make that connection.
That's right.
I firmly believe in the concept of a main street. If you close your eyes and you think about a main street that you know and love, that main street is not online retailers and big box retailers. They may serve their purpose in today's history, but communities, small towns, cities, we deserve and should have, I think, strong, vibrant main streets. And so I realized very early on that that's the sandbox I wanted to play in. My very first teammate, I had two very first teammate stories I'll tell you quickly. Tommy was a returning citizen. He had been in prison for 17 years. I did not know that because I thought that it was terrible to leave the felony checkbox on my application. Now, in the ensuing 20 years, most states, and maybe all at this point, have banned the box, which is the felony checkbox on applications. But at the time, we banned it organically because we just didn't like it. I hired Tommy. He worked with us for 10 years. He taught me more lessons in that first year in particular than I would learn going forward. But he had been in prison for 7 years. Nobody would have hired Tommy and thought, this is going to be a teacher. This man is going to teach me something. My second teammate was a gentleman who came from the Whitman Walker Addiction Services Clinic down the street. He was 6 weeks into a rehabilitation program for a crystal meth addiction and stayed with us for maybe 11 months before he left. And he and I are great friends now. He left really angry, said he never wanted to see us again, but went back and told all of his friends at the clinic that they should come see that lady for a job. And so I ended up, and you can sort of track the trajectory with the stories in my book of that was Shane. Shane sent me somebody who sent me somebody who sent me somebody. And all of these people coming from this addiction services program down the street became my non-traditional teachers. They taught me leadership lessons and human lessons and just all sorts of things that made growing this business so amazing to me. And then 2014, I guess, was the year Mark Wasson, who works on my team, he's worked with us for 20 years, was one of those people. And he came to me one day and he said, the community has started calling our store Recovery Hardware. And I cried because you can't give yourself a nickname. I hadn't set out to do this. I mean, it happened very organically. I deserve zero credit for doing this. And then to find out that anybody, even if it was just two people in the community, thought that was a good name, it meant a lot to me. And people had asked me for years to write a book. And I was like, no one wants to read a book about a chick running a hardware store. Like I used to say that. But when he said this place is nicknamed Recovery Hardware, I was like, that's the book. That is a fantastic name. And I'm going to write it because I want people to know how awesome my team is. So
Gina, so Ange and I were trying to help you craft your future career here a little while ago. And I don't think it's ESOP.
And now we have another cherry on top. Exactly.
ESOP could be a little piece of the story, but what you just talked about was so inspiring, to talk about communities and the part of the recovery community within the community, which, by the way, last week we had a woman, Dr. Terry Webb, who is 90 years old. And
91 years.
91, I'm sorry.
Wow.
She turned 91. That's right. That's right. And she, her new brand is called Trust Terry. And for no pay, she's just putting herself out there and distributing her booklets and books. And she's done a lot. She's just of service to people in terms of how she can help people that are recovering. And
I love it.
And her thing is that in interventions, you have to deal with the family first, which leads to another guest we had, Mike Laverty, a couple of months ago, who has a business in Arizona called Family First Intervention. So he's sort of the pioneer of bringing back that concept in the whole recovery intervention story. So, we have an unintentional theme. We have an unintentional theme here on our show, but it's such a great thing to be talking about. So.
And I apologize, Mark, I didn't mean to interrupt you as well, okay. But I almost take that one step further to complete that circle, which I think then, Gina, comes back to your decision to make an ESOP company, because it's one thing to give people a place to go to heal and be relevant in the community, but then to give them a piece of that ownership and that pride and the trustworthiness and all the things that you talk about in your book. The question I have for you, and it's just an opinion piece, but why don't you think more privately held companies choose this model? I mean, it's just it's a rejuvenating and regenerating type of thing where people are going to be better employees and more vested if they feel that sense of ownership.
Well, I think so. There's only about 6,000 ESOPs nationally. I think that it's just an unknown entity. That's one. I think a lot of people don't know it's an option. Two, I was mistaken in thinking that the employees had to actually put in money, and so that was a roadblock for us before I was set straight by somebody smarter than me. And then it's also expensive and time consuming. I think that it's 100% worth the cost and the time. But if you don't understand the model or have never heard of it, and then you don't want to put in the time and effort, it can be a little bit of a challenge. The other thing, what works in two ways.
It's expensive too. Money has to be invested by the business up front.
Yeah, it's expensive. And we only were able to sell 30% in one tranche, which means I'm still majority owner, which is great, but I could theoretically never get that money if something happened. Now, that's not going to happen, but it's not a one and done. If you sell to somebody one day or private equity, you get your money that day and you're done. You pay a ridiculous amount of taxes, which I didn't have to pay. But I think that's why people don't do it.
We have very little time left. We were afraid this was going to happen.
Yeah.
Real quick, I wanted to ask you about your 3-year vision, but we should do that for another show because we're crafting that as we speak to you. So we're helping you.
Yes.
But let me ask you about, you've already said this, but just take a moment about your legacy. I think it's all been said, but if you had to sum up what you'd like to see as your legacy, what does that look like?
I want my legacy to be the continued success of brick and mortar retail, not just hardware stores, but the communities, the businesses that make Main Street communities vibrant and successful. And I want business owners to know that they can hire people from non-traditional backgrounds and will be successful in their business.
So Ange likes to say she's my Robin Quivers to Howard Stern. And Howard Stern ends a lot of his interviews by saying, Gina Schaefer, you're here. You've done a lot. You've done it all. You've said it all. And it is quite a legacy that you've created in business and in the community. And people are going to say great things. And I know you're not done yet. So we can
Please come back.
Yep.
Thank you.
We'll have you back again. Take care, everyone. Have a great day. And thanks for joining us at Founders Forum.
We hope you enjoyed your time with Founders Forum today and you found value to take with you throughout your day. Join us again next week for another episode of Founders Forum on WWDB Talk Radio and always at the Founders Forum show page at WWDBAM.com.